Our next speaker was the former governor of Pennsylvania and the first Secretary of Homeland Security in the immediate aftermath of 9/11. Please welcome Governor Tom Ridge.
Viva Ashraf! Mrs. Rajavi, it is a great pleasure and a privilege not only to join you in the leadership of the MEK, but the distinguished group of international citizens who are joined in common effort and in common cause to support you in your efforts for the residents of Camp Ashraf. We appreciate your courageous, your principled leadership. We stand with you on your call to perhaps even replace the United Nations as a spokesperson for the residents of Camp Ashraf. They are a fine interlocutor, but no one can better speak to the aspirations and the goals and the needs of the residents than you, Mrs. Rajavi. So, by the way, I think it's unlikely that the Maliki government will welcome you to Baghdad or even a neutral site, but if they do, get a large plane, because I think a lot of people in this audience want to go with you, including those here as well. Ladies and gentlemen, years from now, I suspect that historians from around the world will take a look at what has transpired over the previous 25 or 30 years at Camp Ashraf in Iran, and they're going to write a book about the MEK, about the democratic Iranian opposition, about the intrepid, courageous residents of Camp Ashraf. Many of the members of the panel here have actually witnessed some of those chapters that have probably already been written in the minds of observers for the past 15 or 20 years. Some of us are just recent observers. Some of us are just recent participants. So there have been a few chapters that have been written, but sadly, a few chapters remain. And I think we gather here today, as we've gathered for the past year, and will continue to gather to achieve a regime change in Iran, to replace the mullahs and Ahmadinejad with elected representatives of the people of Iran. We gather at this critical moment as these chapters are yet to be written, and I suggest for my purpose of my remarks today, there might be a couple of themes, at least in this next chapter, that I want the historians to pay attention to. The first theme they may want to write about is the deception that has occurred over the past 4 or 5 months in relationship to some of the negotiations, or all of the negotiations that have gone on, under perhaps the well-intentioned efforts of a lot of people involved, either from the United States or the United Nations, but today the very unsuccessful, timid efforts. The deception I speak of begins with the notion, at least I think many of us who have been on these conference calls and in communication with your leadership of the MEK have been under the impression that once that artificial deadline was established, the UN Special Envoy was announced, that there would be a legitimate effort to negotiate a mutually satisfactory agreement between the leadership of the MEK and the United Nations and the Iraqi government to provide for the safety and security of the residents of the camp. That was the impression that was given. Many of us felt there would be shuttle diplomacy back and forth. The camp, Paris, Baghdad, back and forth, negotiated settlement. Well, that's happened. There has been no negotiation. There has been talk. But the final agreement was not signed by or signed off on even a rhetorical way by the leadership of the MEK. It's a rather deceptive practice to say one thing and do another. Let history record, although there were verbal assurances of the safety and security of the residents, it is not embedded in the agreement. There was one trip to Paris, one trip to Baghdad, and then it was a fait accompli. Here's the memorandum of understanding. Take it or leave it. Mrs. Rajavi, courageous, principled leadership on your part, convincing the residents to rely on you, and I might say to rely on the word of the United States. As unsatisfactory as that memorandum of understanding may be, as disingenuous as they may have been in suggesting that it would be negotiated, you have called upon them to trust you, trust us, trust the international community, trust the UN, and trust the United States. Take the agreement and live by it. Principled, courageous, but there's still more work to do. And I say this to my President, to my Secretary of State, and all the decent and well-intentioned people in this administration. You cannot deny history. You cannot change history. We are the country that asked the residents to surrender their weapons of self-defense. The United States asked, not the UN, not Iran, not Iraq. We asked. We are the country. The United States is the country that gave written assurances. We, the United States of America, we assure you that we will protect you since we have taken away your ability to protect yourself. Big issues involved here, none greater in my judgment than America's credibility. So this notion that we ought to just sit idly by and try to push and move as gently as we possibly can, and I do say this with great respect to those involved in these discussions, you are not a bystander, you are not a witness, you are not an interlocutor, you're not an intermediary. It is absolutely essential, as previous speakers have said and will continue to say, there's a legal and moral obligation to exert every conceivable influence you possibly can to assure the safety and security of these residents. It's the United States' responsibility. I think the historians will probably talk about some of the legitimate demands that the residents are calling upon the broader world community to support. They've made the single largest concession possible in order to avoid another massacre. They've agreed to be relocated to Camp Liberty. At one time, they thought it was a military camp. They thought it was of massive size, and all of a sudden, it has been compressed to a small area around which they are building walls, which doesn't sound like a resettlement camp, it sounds more like a prison. And we must demand that the U.S. and the UN live up to those promises made early on in the discussions about humane conditions at Camp Liberty, the preservation and protection of privacy. We do have 1,000 women. We've been told that there will be a robust U.S. presence there to observe, which we think is very important, but we're still unsure what that means. We're told that there'll be UN observers there, but we don't know whether they're going to be intermingled with the residents or whether or not they're going to be outside the prison walls or gates and only allowed access when the Iraqi government chooses to allow them access. We see no reason whatsoever. It's not an unreasonable demand to keep the Iraqi police and the Iraqi army outside of Camp Liberty. It's a matter of sovereignty. It's on Iraqi soil. We appreciate that. There is no reason for them to be involved and have personnel inside Camp Liberty. None whatsoever. And you know why we're concerned about that? Let history not record that this panel said publicly that there was an incident or two inside the camp precipitated by either the police or by the Iraqi army and used as an excuse for the humanitarian massacre and onslaught that all of us are working so hard to resist. The demands are reasonable. And I say to the UN Special Envoy, to our Special Envoy, you must use every influence you possibly can. And for those who say we're not part of this anymore, I remind my friends in the United States, 4,400 Gold Star mothers in America whose sons and daughters have been killed to bring self-governance and democracy to Iraq. And I would dare say I would not want to be speaking for them, the pain, the sorrow, the anguish to have lost someone in Iraq. But I can't believe that a single American parent who lost a son or daughter on the field of battle in Iraq would tolerate a United States government sitting idly by while the government that their sons and daughters lost their life in fighting to preserve and protect went in and massacred innocent, defenseless citizens of another country. It is un-American. Un-American, unworthy of America. I like to tell people from time to time, America, if it were a product, what we try to sell is a brand. You know, every product that you like, there's a brand associated with it and you're attracted to it. Well, sometimes I think America gets a little preachy around the world about our brand. There are certain characteristics of our country of which I'm particularly proud, and it is the freedom and the tolerance and the diversity. It's also the rule of law, the Constitution of the United States, our credibility. So the fourth theme that I think we need to, hopefully the historians will record, is that our persistent cry to delist, delist, delist was finally heard by the United States government. The EU, the UK, even the courts in the United States have said there is no reason. There's no legal justification. My colleagues here have heard it, and perhaps you've heard me mention this before, ladies and gentlemen, but every day while I was privileged to serve my government, both in the White House and as Secretary of Homeland Security, just about every day for almost 4 years, I got a list of terrorist threats against the United States. And I must tell you, not on one occasion, in those 4 years getting those lists, sometimes it was a couple pages, sometimes it was a couple dozen pages, but at no time did I see a reference to the MEK. Never. And what an irony, what an absolute irony it is for the greatest terrorist state in the world, the most significant terrorist state in the world, the exporter of terrorism around the world, that's got surrogates, Hamas, Hezbollah, the Islamic Jihad, we all know what it is, for them to be having so much influence in Baghdad after we've sacrificed blood and treasure to give this regime an opportunity to create a freedom-loving society. Delist, delist, delist. Do it now. And Mrs. Rajavi, again, it is a high honor for me to be associated with you, but also with the distinguished international presence here on the panel. And I pledge to you, I dare say I'm not going to speak. I rarely speak for a crowd other than myself or an individual other than myself, but I think I'm in pretty safe territory if I say that all of us are with you side by side as long as it takes